Princess Eleanor sat at the far end of the mahogany dining table, her fingers trembling as she reached for her water glass. The crystal felt cold against her palm, but she knew better than to drink from it immediately. In the royal household of Valdoria, even the simplest actions carried weight beyond their appearance. Her father, King Frederick, had not looked at her once since entering the dining room. His attention remained fixed on the evening newspaper, folded precisely in half beside his dinner plate. Eleanor recognized this signal immediately. When the king placed his newspaper to the left of his plate, it meant he was displeased with someone at the table. When he folded it in half, that displeasure was directed at her. The heavy silence stretched across the ornate dining room like a thick blanket. Servants moved around the table with practiced silence, their footsteps muffled by the deep burgundy carpet. Each one had learned the unspoken rules that governed these evening meals. They knew which fork placement meant the meal was acceptable, which glass position indicated political tension, and, most importantly, when to disappear entirely from view. Eleanor's mother, Queen Isabella, entered the room with measured steps. Her emerald dress rustled softly as she took her seat at the opposite end of the table from her husband. She placed her napkin across her lap with deliberate care, then reached for her wineglass with her left hand instead of her right. Eleanor's heart sank further. When the queen used her left hand for her wine, it meant she supported whatever punishment the king had decided upon. The first course arrived in silence. Cream of mushroom soup, served in bone china bowls with gold trim. Eleanor watched her father lift his spoon with clinical precision. He took exactly 3 sips, then placed the spoon at the 4 o'clock position on his bowl's rim. This was the signal Eleanor had been dreading. The 4 o'clock position meant her transgression was serious enough to warrant a formal family meeting after dinner. Eleanor's younger brother, Prince Marcus, slipped into the room 20 minutes late. His school uniform was wrinkled, his tie askew, and there was what looked like paint under his fingernails. At 15, Marcus had not yet mastered the subtle art of royal dinner communication, but he was learning fast. He glanced around the table, noting the positions of glasses, the placement of silverware, and, most importantly, his father's newspaper. Marcus took his seat and immediately reached for his bread roll with both hands. Eleanor watched in horror as he broke it apart carelessly, sending crumbs scattering across his plate. In the royal dining code, bread broken with both hands indicated either complete ignorance of the situation or open defiance. Given Marcus's quick glance at their father's newspaper, Eleanor knew it wasn't ignorance. Queen Isabella cleared her throat softly, twice in quick succession. This was her warning signal to Marcus, but he either didn't hear it or chose to ignore it. He continued eating his bread with enthusiasm, even going so far as to butter it with exaggerated care. Eleanor realized her brother was deliberately drawing attention away from her and onto himself. The main course arrived with ceremonial fanfare, despite the tension thick in the air. Roasted lamb with rosemary, accompanied by roasted vegetables and Duchess potatoes. The aroma filled the dining room, but Eleanor found she had lost her appetite entirely. She cut her meat into small, precise pieces, arranging them carefully on her plate without eating. King Frederick finally spoke, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Eleanor, I trust you understand why we're gathered here this evening." Eleanor's knife clinked against her plate as her hand shook slightly. "Yes, father. Your behavior today at the charity luncheon was noted by several members of Parliament. Lord Pemberton was particularly concerned about your outburst." The word outburst hung in the air like an accusation. Eleanor remembered the moment vividly. She had been seated next to Lord Pemberton during the Children's Hospital fundraiser when he made a casual comment about how the poor should be grateful for whatever charity they received. Unable to contain herself, Eleanor had corrected him, pointing out that healthcare was a right, not a privilege to be granted by the wealthy. Queen Isabella set down her wineglass with deliberate force, the base striking the table with a sharp clink. This sound was the royal equivalent of slamming a gavel. It meant the discussion was now officially serious, and any further transgressions would have immediate consequences. "Eleanor," the Queen said, her voice carefully modulated, "we've discussed the importance of maintaining diplomatic relations with all members of Parliament, regardless of personal opinion." "But, Mother, what he said was what he said," King Frederick interrupted, "is irrelevant to your role as a representative of this crown. Your personal opinions have no place at public functions." Marcus suddenly dropped his fork with a loud clatter. All eyes turned to him as he mumbled an apology and bent to retrieve it. Eleanor realized this was another deliberate distraction, her brother's attempt to break the mounting tension. When he straightened up, he caught her eye and gave the slightest nod toward the door.
Eleanor understood immediately.
Marcus was offering her an escape route, but she knew she couldn't take it.
Running away from this conversation would only make things worse.
She had learned that lesson years ago when she was 12 and tried to hide from a similar confrontation about her friendship with the gardener's daughter. The dessert course arrived as the family sat in uncomfortable silence. Chocolate mousse with gold leaf, served in crystal bowls that reflected the candlelight. Eleanor watched her father's careful movements as he lifted his spoon. He took exactly 2 spoonfuls, then placed his spoon at the 2 o'clock position. This meant he was willing to listen to her explanation, but her next words would determine the severity of her punishment.
Eleanor took a deep breath.
Father, I understand that my words may have seemed inappropriate, but Lord Pemberton was speaking about children who are dying because they can't afford medical treatment.
I couldn't sit there and say nothing.
King Frederick's expression didn't change, but he moved his water glass 2 inches to the left.
Eleanor's heart leaped. This small movement meant he was considering her words, weighing them against his duty to maintain political stability.
Queen Isabella leaned forward slightly, her hands folded in her lap. Eleanor, your compassion is admirable, but there are proper channels for addressing such concerns.
Public embarrassment of government officials is not among them.
What are the proper channels?
Eleanor asked, her voice stronger now. Letters that go unanswered? Private meetings where nothing changes? How many children have to die while we follow proper channels?
The silence that followed was deafening. Even the servants seemed to have vanished entirely, leaving the family alone with their words and their unspoken codes. Marcus cleared his throat and spoke for the first time since entering the room.
Maybe Eleanor has a point. Maybe sometimes proper channels aren't enough.
King Frederick's gaze shifted to his son, and Eleanor saw something she had never seen before in her father's eyes.
Not anger, but consideration.
Marcus had always been the rebel, the one who questioned everything. Perhaps his words carried weight precisely because everyone expected them. Queen Isabella reached for her wineglass with her right hand this time, then switched it to her left before taking a sip. Eleanor had never seen this particular signal before, but she sensed it meant something significant. King Frederick folded his newspaper completely and placed it beside his plate. This was new territory for all of them. Eleanor knew that a fully folded newspaper meant the conversation was entering uncharted waters, moving beyond established protocols and into genuine discussion. Eleanor, the king said slowly, tell me exactly what Lord Pemberton said, and exactly how you responded.
For the next 30 minutes, Eleanor recounted every detail of the luncheon conversation.
She spoke about the statistics she had quoted, the sources she had cited, and the way Lord Pemberton's face had turned red when she questioned his assumptions about poverty and healthcare access. As she spoke, she watched her parents' faces carefully. Her mother's expression remained neutral, but she noticed the Queen's hands had relaxed in her lap. Her father listened without interruption, his fingers steepled in front of him in what Eleanor knew was his thinking position. When she finished speaking, King Frederick was quiet for a long moment. Then, he picked up his wineglass and took a slow sip, looking directly at Eleanor as he did so. Eye contact during wine consumption was the rarest of all royal dinner signals. It meant complete attention and serious consideration. Your facts were correct, he asked.
Yes, father.
I researched them thoroughly after reading about the children's hospital funding crisis.
Queen Isabella leaned back in her chair, a gesture that Eleanor recognized as surprise. You researched this on your own?
I've been researching healthcare access for months. I wanted to understand the real impact of the funding cuts before I attended any more charity events. Marcus grinned openly now, abandoning all pretense of formal dinner behavior.
She's been staying up until midnight reading medical journals and government reports. I've seen the books in her room.
Eleanor shot her brother a grateful look. His casual revelation had just transformed her passionate outburst from an emotional reaction into evidence of serious, thoughtful preparation. King Frederick set down his wineglass and looked directly at his daughter.
Eleanor, what you did today was inappropriate.
However, your commitment to understanding the issues before speaking about them shows maturity beyond your years. Eleanor felt her chest tighten with hope and apprehension. This wasn't the condemnation she had expected, but it wasn't approval either. The Queen spoke next, her voice softer than before. Eleanor, your heart is in the right place, but your methods need refinement.
There are ways to effect change without creating political enemies. Will you teach me? Eleanor asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. The question hung in the air as her parents exchanged a look that Eleanor couldn't interpret. It was a conversation conducted entirely in glances and micro-expressions, a language developed over 25 years of marriage and joint rule. Finally, King Frederick nodded slowly. We will discuss this further tomorrow. For now, you are confined to the palace for 1 week. Use that time to prepare a formal proposal for how you believe the royal family should address healthcare accessibility. Eleanor's eyes widened. This wasn't the punishment she had expected. Instead of being silenced, she was being asked to formalize her thoughts, to present her ideas in a way that could actually create change. Marcus raised his water glass in a mock toast. To Eleanor, future minister of difficult conversations. Despite everything, Queen Isabella smiled at this, and even King Frederick's stern expression softened slightly. As the meal ended and the family began to disperse, Eleanor lingered at the table. The dining room felt different now, less like a courtroom and more like a place where important conversations could happen. She looked at the empty plates, the carefully positioned glasses, the folded newspaper that had started it all. Tomorrow, she would begin working on her proposal. But tonight, she sat in the quiet dining room and thought about all the unspoken words that had passed between her family members through nothing more than the placement of silverware and the angle of a wineglass. The royal dinner codes had revealed more than displeasure and disappointment tonight. They had uncovered possibility, understanding, and, perhaps most surprisingly, a path forward that none of them had expected when the meal began. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the palace library as Eleanor spread documents across the mahogany reading table. Her week of confinement had begun, but, instead of feeling trapped, she felt energized by the challenge her father had set before her. The formal proposal on healthcare accessibility had consumed her thoughts since their dinner conversation 3 days ago. Eleanor had always loved the library's silence, but this morning it felt different. Every book around her seemed to whisper possibilities, every document a potential piece of the puzzle she was trying to solve. She had requested access to government healthcare reports, hospital funding records, and international case studies. The palace staff had been surprisingly helpful, perhaps sensing that this project had her parents' approval. A soft knock interrupted her concentration. She looked up to see Thomas, the head butler, standing in the doorway with a silver tea service. Your Highness, your mother requests that you join the family for lunch today. Standard formal service. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Standard formal service meant the full royal treatment, 7 courses, specific seating arrangements, and, most importantly, the complete array of wordless dinner codes. After 3 days of eating simple meals in her room while working on her proposal, she had almost forgotten about the complex dance of royal dining communication. Did she indicate the nature of the meal? Eleanor asked carefully. Thomas's expression remained neutral, but Eleanor caught the slight hesitation before he answered. Her Majesty mentioned that Lord Pemberton would be joining the family. Eleanor's hands went cold. Lord Pemberton, the same man she had confronted at the charity luncheon, would be sitting at their table. This wasn't a family meal, it was a test. Her parents were creating a controlled environment where she could demonstrate whether she had learned anything from their previous conversation. Thank you, Thomas. Please inform Her Majesty that I will attend. After Thomas left, Eleanor stared at her research materials with new urgency. She had less than 3 hours to organize her thoughts and prepare for what would essentially be a diplomatic examination disguised as lunch. Eleanor spent the morning rehearsing various scenarios in her mind. She practiced modulating her voice, controlling her expressions, and, most importantly, reading the subtle signals that would tell her how to navigate the conversation. She knew that one wrong move could undo any progress she had made with her parents. At precisely 12:30, Eleanor entered the formal dining room. The table was set for 5, her parents, Marcus, herself, and Lord Pemberton. The place settings were more elaborate than usual, with multiple glasses and an array of silverware that spoke to the meal's political importance. Lord Pemberton was already seated, engaged in what appeared to be pleasant conversation with King Frederick about parliamentary procedures. Eleanor noticed immediately that her father's newspaper was nowhere to be seen, a positive sign that suggested this meal was about dialogue rather than judgment. Queen Isabella gestured for Eleanor to take the seat directly across from Lord Pemberton. This positioning was deliberate and strategic. Eleanor would be forced to maintain eye contact with the man she had publicly disagreed with,
while her parents could observe every interaction from their positions at the head and foot of the table. Marcus arrived last, sliding into his chair with characteristic casualness. But Eleanor noticed that today his uniform was perfectly pressed, his tie straight, and his hands clean. Her brother was taking this meal as seriously as she was. The first course arrived without fanfare, a light cucumber soup with herbs. Eleanor watched carefully as Lord Pemberton lifted his spoon. He ate with precise, measured movements, occasionally glancing at her parents as if seeking approval for his table manners. This was clearly a man who understood the importance of making a good impression. King Frederick began the conversation with neutral topics, the weather, recent parliamentary votes, and upcoming social events. Eleanor recognized this as a warm-up phase, designed to establish a comfortable atmosphere before moving into more sensitive territory. Lord Pemberton, Queen Isabella said as the second course arrived, "I understand you have some concerns about recent public interactions regarding healthcare policy." Eleanor's pulse quickened. Her mother had just opened the door to the very conversation that had started this entire situation. Lord Pemberton set down his fork and turned his attention fully to the Queen. "Indeed, Your Majesty. While I have great respect for Princess Eleanor's passion for social issues, I worry about the precedent set when members of the royal family publicly contradict government officials." Eleanor felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain calm. She looked at her father's water glass and saw that he had positioned it directly in front of his plate, a signal that meant she should listen without responding unless directly addressed. "I appreciate your concerns, Lord Pemberton," King Frederick replied smoothly. "However, I believe there may have been some misunderstanding about the nature of Princess Eleanor's comments. Perhaps she could clarify her position?" This was it. Eleanor took a careful breath and looked directly at Lord Pemberton. "Lord Pemberton, I believe our conversation at the charity luncheon may have come across differently than I intended. My goal was not to contradict you personally, but to share information that I thought might be relevant to our discussion about healthcare funding." Lord Pemberton's eyebrows rose slightly. "Information? I was under the impression that you were simply expressing personal opinions." Eleanor reached for her water glass with her right hand, then switched to her left, a signal she had seen her mother use to indicate careful consideration. "I've spent the past several months researching healthcare accessibility, particularly as it relates to children's medical needs. When you mentioned that the poor should be grateful for charity-based healthcare, I shared some statistics about mortality rates among children who rely solely on charitable care versus those with guaranteed access to medical treatment." Marcus, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "What kind of statistics?" Eleanor realized her brother was giving her an opening to present her research in a non-confrontational way. For example, children with guaranteed healthcare access have a 40% lower mortality rate for treatable conditions compared to those dependent on charity-based care. The delay in treatment while waiting for charitable funding approval often means the difference between simple outpatient procedures and complex emergency interventions. Lord Pemberton leaned forward, his expression shifting from defensive to curious. "Where did you find these statistics?" "Medical journals, government health reports, and international comparative studies. I can provide you with specific sources if you're interested." Eleanor watched her father's face carefully. King Frederick was cutting his meat with deliberate precision, which she knew meant he was pleased with how the conversation was developing. Queen Isabella set down her wineglass and leaned slightly forward. "Lord Pemberton, what concerns you more, the content of Eleanor's information, or the setting in which she shared it?" This was a masterful question, Eleanor realized. Her mother was forcing Lord Pemberton to distinguish between the substance of the disagreement and the protocol issue. Lord Pemberton was quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. "Your Majesty, if I'm being honest, the information itself was surprising. I hadn't seen those particular studies." Eleanor felt a surge of hope. Lord Pemberton wasn't dismissing her research, he was admitting unfamiliarity with it. "However," he continued, "my concern remains about the appropriateness of public disagreement between members of the royal family and elected officials." King Frederick finally spoke, his voice measured and thoughtful. "Lord Pemberton, what if the disagreement wasn't public contradiction, but rather collaborative information sharing?" Eleanor wasn't sure what her father meant, but she could see that he was leading the conversation somewhere specific. "I'm not certain I follow, Your Majesty. What if Princess Eleanor's research could be shared with relevant parliamentary committees in a formal capacity? Rather than having these conversations at charity luncheons,
What if there was an official channel for royal input on social policy research? Eleanor's heart began to race. Her father was suggesting something unprecedented, a formal role for her in government policy discussions. Lord Pemberton looked genuinely intrigued now. An official advisory capacity? Not advisory, Queen Isabella corrected. Research-based information sharing. Eleanor clearly has a talent for gathering and analyzing data about social issues. Perhaps the talent could be utilized in a way that strengthens rather than threatens government relationships. Eleanor realized her parents had orchestrated this entire conversation.
They hadn't invited Lord Pemberton to punish her or force an apology. They had invited him to propose a solution that would transform her perceived transgression into an official asset. Marcus, who had been following the conversation with obvious fascination, suddenly grinned.
So Eleanor would become like a royal researcher?
King Frederick smiled at his son's enthusiasm.
Something like that. Lord Pemberton, how would Parliament respond to receiving well-researched briefings on social policy issues from a member of the royal family?
Lord Pemberton was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the political implications. Eleanor watched him carefully, trying to read his expression. Finally, he looked directly at her.
Princess Eleanor, would you be willing to present your healthcare research to the Parliamentary Committee on Health and Social Services? Eleanor felt as if the room had suddenly tilted. You want me to present to Parliament?
Not as a royal making demands, Lord Pemberton clarified, but as a researcher sharing findings. If your information is as comprehensive as it sounds, it could be genuinely valuable to our policy discussions. Queen Isabella reached for her wineglass with her right hand, the signal for approval and encouragement. Eleanor looked at her father and saw that he had moved his newspaper to the right side of his plate, which meant he was proud of how she was handling the situation. I would be honored to present my research, Eleanor said carefully, but I would want to ensure that it's presented in a way that supports rather than undermines current policy discussions. Lord Pemberton smiled for the first time since arriving.
Princess Eleanor, that's exactly the attitude that would make such a presentation valuable.
You're clearly willing to contribute without trying to control. The main course arrived as the conversation took on an increasingly collaborative tone. Eleanor found herself describing her research methodology, the sources she had consulted, and the gaps in data that she had identified.
Lord Pemberton asked detailed questions, occasionally suggesting additional sources or alternative analytical approaches.
Marcus watched this exchange with obvious delight, occasionally asking questions that helped clarify technical points. Eleanor realized her brother was learning as much from observing this conversation as she was from participating in it. As the meal progressed, Eleanor began to understand something fundamental about royal dinner codes that she had never grasped before. They weren't just about communication between family members, they were tools for navigating complex social and political situations. Every gesture, every placement of silverware, every pause in conversation was part of a larger diplomatic dance. When dessert arrived, King Frederick made a gesture that Eleanor had never seen before. He picked up his dessert spoon and placed it horizontally across the top of his dessert plate before taking a single bite. Eleanor wasn't sure what this meant, but she sensed it was significant.
Queen Isabella apparently understood the signal, because she immediately turned to Lord Pemberton with renewed focus. Lord Pemberton, assuming Eleanor's presentation to the Parliamentary Committee goes well, would there be interest in establishing an ongoing research relationship? Eleanor's breath caught.
Her mother was suggesting something even more ambitious than a single presentation.
Lord Pemberton considered this carefully.
Your Majesty, if the quality of Princess Eleanor's work meets parliamentary standards, I believe there could definitely be interest in regular briefings on various social policy issues.
Eleanor felt as if she were floating.
3 days ago, she had been confined to the palace as punishment for speaking out of turn.
Now, she was being offered the possibility of an ongoing role in government policy research.
There would need to be clear protocols, King Frederick added. Guidelines about how research findings are presented, how they're integrated into policy discussions, and how to maintain appropriate boundaries between royal input and government decision-making.
Lord Pemberton nodded eagerly. Absolutely. But, Your Majesty, if I may say so, having access to this kind of independent research could be tremendously valuable. Princess Eleanor's work appears to be thorough and objective.
As the meal drew to a close, Eleanor felt a sense of transformation that went far beyond the immediate conversation. She had entered this dining room as a princess who had spoken out of turn. she was leaving as someone whose voice might actually matter in creating the changes she cared about. The wordless codes that had governed their family meals for years had just created something entirely new, a bridge between royal passion and governmental action, mediated by the careful dance of diplomatic conversation. 2 weeks had passed since Eleanor's presentation to the Parliamentary Committee on Health and Social Services, and the palace dining room had never felt more charged with possibility. Eleanor's research on healthcare accessibility had not only been well received by Parliament, but had sparked 3 additional committee requests for briefings on education, housing, and employment policy. Tonight's dinner, however, carried a different kind of tension. Eleanor's newfound role had created unexpected ripples throughout the royal household, and not all of them were positive. Lady Catherine Worthington, the Queen's longtime advisor on social protocol, had requested an urgent family meeting to discuss what she termed the dangerous precedent of royal political involvement. Eleanor sat at her usual place at the dining table, but everything else felt different. The silverware seemed heavier in her hands, each movement more deliberate. She had learned to read her family's wordless codes with increasing sophistication over the past month, but tonight she sensed undercurrents she couldn't quite interpret. King Frederick entered the dining room with his newspaper tucked under his left arm rather than his right, a signal Eleanor had never seen before. She glanced at Marcus, who caught her eye and shrugged slightly. Even her brother, who had become surprisingly adept at reading their parents' signals, seemed confused by this new development. Queen Isabella arrived moments later, followed by Lady Catherine. Eleanor's stomach tightened as she watched the older woman's careful assessment of the room. Lady Catherine had served the royal family for over 30 years and was known for her unwavering commitment to tradition and protocol. Her presence tonight suggested that Eleanor's activities had raised concerns at the highest levels of palace administration. Lady Catherine took the seat that had been prepared for her between Marcus and Eleanor's mother. Eleanor noticed that the woman's place setting included an extra fork, the formal indicator that she would be speaking on matters of official palace business rather than participating in family conversation. The first course arrived with unusual ceremony. Instead of the typical informal service that characterized family meals, tonight's dinner was being served with full court protocol. Each dish was announced, each course presented with the elaborate rituals typically reserved for state dinners. Eleanor realized this formality was deliberate. Lady Catherine was insisting that this conversation be conducted with maximum official gravity. King Frederick began eating his soup with mechanical precision, taking exactly 5 spoonfuls before placing his spoon at the 1 o'clock position. Eleanor's heart sank. The 1 o'clock position meant serious displeasure, the kind that usually preceded major changes in palace policy. Lady Catherine cleared her throat delicately and addressed the table. Your Majesties, I've requested this meeting because I believe we need to discuss the implications of Princess Eleanor's recent activities. Eleanor noticed that Lady Catherine emphasized the word activities as if it were distasteful. She forced herself to remain silent, waiting for her parents to respond. Queen Isabella reached for her water glass with her left hand, then deliberately switched it to her right before taking a sip. Eleanor knew this signal meant her mother was reserving judgment, waiting to hear all sides of the conversation before taking a position. Lady Catherine, King Frederick said carefully, please elaborate on your concerns. Your Majesty, in my 30 years of service to this crown, I have never seen a member of the royal family become so directly involved in government policy. Princess Eleanor's presentations to parliamentary committees, while well-intentioned, represent a fundamental departure from constitutional tradition. Eleanor felt her cheeks burning, but she kept her eyes focused on her soup. She could see Marcus shifting uncomfortably in his seat, clearly wanting to speak in her defense but unsure whether it was appropriate. Lady Catherine continued, her voice growing more confident. The monarchy's strength has always come from its position above political controversy. When Princess Eleanor presents research that influences policy decisions, she risks entangling the crown in partisan debate. King Frederick set down his soup spoon and looked directly at Lady Catherine. Are you suggesting that Princess Eleanor's research has been partisan? Not deliberately, Your Majesty. But the very act of a royal family member providing information that influences government decisions creates the appearance of political involvement. Eleanor couldn't remain silent any longer. Lady Catherine, may I ask a question? The older woman nodded stiffly. When I researched healthcare accessibility, I examined data from multiple sources and presented objective findings. How is sharing factual information different from the royal family's traditional role in supporting charitable causes? Lady Catherine's expression sharpened. Princess Eleanor, charitable support and policy influence are entirely different matters.
When the royal family supports a hospital charity, we're providing assistance without directing government action.
When you present research that influences parliamentary decisions, you're crossing a constitutional line. Eleanor felt frustration rising in her chest, but she forced herself to speak calmly.
What if government decisions could save more children's lives than charitable support ever could? Don't we have a responsibility to share information that could prevent unnecessary deaths? The silence that followed was so complete that Eleanor could hear the clock ticking in the hallway.
Lady Catherine's face had gone pale, and Eleanor realized she might have just made a serious mistake. Queen Isabella placed her napkin beside her plate and spoke with careful deliberation. Eleanor, your passion is admirable, but Lady Catherine raises valid concerns about constitutional precedent. Eleanor felt her world tilting. Her mother's words sounded like the beginning of a decision to end her research role before it had truly begun.
Marcus suddenly dropped his fork with a loud clatter, breaking the tension. As he bent to retrieve it, he whispered just loudly enough for Eleanor to hear, "Don't give up."
When Marcus straightened up, he looked directly at Lady Catherine.
"May I ask something? If Eleanor's research is helping save children's lives, why is tradition more important than that?"
Lady Catherine's eyes flashed with disapproval.
"Prince Marcus, tradition isn't arbitrary preference.
Constitutional limits on royal political involvement exist to protect the monarchy from becoming embroiled in controversial political decisions." King Frederick leaned forward slightly.
"Lady Catherine, what specific harm do you foresee from Eleanor's research activities?"
"Your Majesty, if Princess Eleanor's research influences policy decisions that prove unpopular, public criticism will be directed at the royal family. If her recommendations are seen as favoring particular political parties, we risk accusations of royal bias.
Most dangerously, if other royals begin following Princess Eleanor's example, we could find ourselves with family members advocating for conflicting policies."
Eleanor realized that Lady Catherine's concerns weren't entirely unfounded. The potential for royal family members to become inadvertently involved in political controversy was real.
The second course arrived as the family sat in thoughtful silence.
Roasted duck with cherry sauce, accompanied by seasonal vegetables.
Eleanor watched her father carefully as he began cutting his meat.
He made 3 precise cuts, then paused with his knife and fork positioned at perfect right angles. This was a signal Eleanor had never seen before, but she sensed it meant he was weighing complex considerations.
Queen Isabella spoke next, her voice measured. "Lady Catherine, what if we established specific protocols for royal research activities? Guidelines that would allow Eleanor to continue her work while maintaining appropriate constitutional boundaries?"
Eleanor's heart leaped with hope, but Lady Catherine's expression remained skeptical.
"Your Majesty, what kind of protocols could possibly address these constitutional concerns?"
King Frederick set down his silverware entirely and looked around the table.
"What if Eleanor's research was conducted through an independent foundation rather than as direct royal activity?"
The information could still reach parliamentary committees, but without the constitutional implications of direct royal political involvement. Eleanor felt excitement building in her chest. Her father was suggesting a way to continue her work while addressing Lady Catherine's concerns.
Furthermore, Queen Isabella added, what if Eleanor's research focused exclusively on areas where there is broad bipartisan consensus about the importance of improvement?
Healthcare for children, education accessibility, housing for the vulnerable areas where her work would support existing government priorities rather than advocating for policy changes.
Lady Catherine was quiet for several minutes, clearly considering the proposal.
Eleanor watched the older woman's face carefully, trying to read her expression. "Your Majesties," Lady Catherine finally said, "such an approach might address some of my concerns, but there would need to be strict oversight to ensure that Princess Eleanor's work remains within appropriate boundaries." Eleanor realized this was as close to approval as she was likely to get from Lady Catherine. The woman wasn't endorsing her activities enthusiastically, but she was acknowledging a path forward.
Marcus grinned openly. "So Eleanor gets to keep helping people, but with more rules?"
King Frederick smiled at his son's directness.
"Marcus, that's essentially correct.
Eleanor would continue her research, but within a framework that protects both her work and the Crown's constitutional position." Eleanor felt tears prickling at her eyes, but she forced herself to speak calmly. "I would welcome any oversight or guidelines that would allow me to continue this work responsibly." Lady Catherine's expression softened slightly. Princess Eleanor, I want to be clear that my concerns come from a desire to protect both you and the monarchy. If you're willing to work within strict constitutional boundaries, I believe we can find a way forward."
The main course continued as the family discussed practical details. Eleanor would establish a research foundation with independent oversight. Her work would focus on areas of bipartisan governmental concern. All research would be reviewed by constitutional experts before being shared with parliamentary committees.
As dessert arrived, chocolate soufflé with raspberry coulis, Eleanor felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with determination. The conversation had been difficult, but it had resulted in a framework that would allow her to continue making a difference while respecting the constitutional traditions that protected her family's role. King Frederick picked up his dessert spoon and placed it vertically alongside his plate before taking his first bite. Eleanor had never seen this signal before, but something about her father's expression suggested it was positive. Queen Isabella apparently understood, because she smiled and reached across the table to touch Eleanor's hand briefly.
"Eleanor, we're proud of the work you've done and the maturity you've shown in addressing these concerns."
Lady Catherine, who had been largely silent during dessert, finally spoke again.
"Princess Eleanor, I owe you an apology.
I approached this conversation focused on potential problems rather than acknowledging the genuine good your research has accomplished."
Eleanor felt a wave of surprise and gratitude.
"Lady Catherine, your concerns have helped me understand important aspects of my role that I hadn't fully considered."
"I'm grateful for your guidance." Marcus raised his water glass in a mock toast.
"To Eleanor's new research foundation, and to boring constitutional protocols that let her keep saving lives." Despite the seriousness of the conversation, everyone at the table smiled at Marcus's irreverent summary.
As the meal ended, Eleanor realized that the evening's wordless codes had revealed something she hadn't expected.
The dinner codes weren't just about family communication, they were tools for navigating the complex balance between personal conviction and institutional responsibility. Her father's newspaper positions, her mother's glass placements, even Lady Catherine's formal silverware arrangement had all contributed to a conversation that honored both Eleanor's desire to create change and the constitutional traditions that gave her family the stability to support that change. The royal dinner codes had once again proven their power to facilitate difficult conversations and create paths forward that honored both tradition and progress.
6 months had transformed everything.
Eleanor's research foundation had published 3 comprehensive reports that influenced major policy changes affecting thousands of children across the kingdom. Tonight's dinner would be unlike any other in the palace's recent history, because Eleanor had invited someone special to join the family meal, Dr. Sarah Martinez, a pediatric surgeon whose work had inspired Eleanor's latest research project.
Dr. Martinez represented something unprecedented at the royal dinner table, a working-class professional whose presence was based entirely on expertise rather than social position or political influence.
Eleanor had spent weeks convincing her parents that this dinner was necessary, arguing that they needed to hear directly from someone implementing the policies her research had helped shape. Eleanor arrived at the dining room early, her stomach churning with nervous energy. The table had been set for 6, with Dr. Martinez's place positioned between Eleanor and Marcus. She had specifically requested this seating arrangement to ensure the doctor would feel supported during what would undoubtedly be an intimidating experience. King Frederick entered carrying his newspaper folded lengthwise and tucked under his right arm, a signal Eleanor now recognized as cautious optimism mixed with serious concern. Her father was willing to proceed with this unusual dinner, but he expected everyone to be on their best behavior. Queen Isabella arrived wearing her sapphire necklace, which Eleanor knew was reserved for occasions when the Queen wanted to demonstrate both formality and warmth. The jewelry choice suggested that her mother was taking this dinner seriously while trying to make their guest feel welcome. Marcus bounded into the room with characteristic energy, but Eleanor noticed he had taken extra care with his appearance. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his hair neatly combed, and his hands scrubbed clean. Even her irreverent brother understood the importance of this evening. Dr. Martinez arrived precisely on time, escorted by Thomas the head butler. Eleanor watched her guest's reaction to the dining room's formal grandeur. The doctor's eyes widened slightly as she took in the crystal chandeliers, oil paintings, and elaborate table setting, but her expression remained composed and professional. "Your Majesties," Dr. Martinez said with a slight bow, "thank you for inviting me to your home." Eleanor felt a surge of pride at how naturally the doctor handled the formal introduction. She had been right to trust that Dr. Martinez's confidence and expertise would translate well to this setting. King Frederick rose slightly from his chair in acknowledgement. Dr. Martinez, Princess Eleanor speaks very highly of your work.
We're honored to have you join us this evening. As everyone took their seats, Eleanor watched the interplay of formal protocol and genuine curiosity around the table.
Her parents were clearly intrigued by this woman whose medical expertise had informed their daughter's policy research, while Dr. Martinez seemed fascinated by the opportunity to observe royal family dynamics up close. The first course arrived with slightly less ceremony than usual, cream of leek soup served in simple bowls rather than the ornate china typically used for formal dinners. Eleanor recognized this as her mother's attempt to make the meal feel less intimidating for their guest. Queen Isabella began the conversation with gentle questions about Dr. Martinez's background and training. Eleanor listened as the doctor described growing up in a working-class family, earning scholarships for medical school, and specializing in pediatric surgery at the kingdom's largest public hospital. Dr. Martinez, King Frederick said as the second course arrived, Eleanor tells us that your hospital has implemented some of the programs recommended in her research reports.
Yes, Your Majesty.
The expanded emergency care protocols that Princess Eleanor researched have reduced our pediatric mortality rate by almost 20% over the past 4 months. Eleanor felt her chest swell with pride, but she noticed something interesting in her father's reaction. He had positioned his water glass directly in front of his plate and taken a sip while maintaining eye contact with Dr. Martinez, a signal that indicated complete attention and genuine respect. Dr. Martinez continued, "What made Princess Eleanor's research so valuable was her focus on practical implementation rather than just theoretical recommendations. She spent time understanding how changes would actually work in a hospital setting."
Marcus leaned forward with obvious interest. What kind of practical stuff did Eleanor research?
Well, Prince Marcus, your sister discovered that our biggest problem wasn't lack of medical equipment, but delays in getting approval for expensive treatments.
Her research showed that a simple change in paperwork procedures could save crucial time in emergency situations. Eleanor watched her parents exchange a glance that she couldn't quite interpret.
There was surprise in their expressions, but also something that looked like pride. Queen Isabella set down her fork and looked directly at Dr. Martinez.
Doctor, in your professional opinion, has Princess Eleanor's research made a meaningful difference in children's healthcare outcomes? The directness of the question surprised everyone at the table, including Eleanor. Her mother was asking for a professional assessment that would either validate or undermine Eleanor's entire research initiative. Dr. Martinez didn't hesitate. Your Majesty, Princess Eleanor's work has saved children's lives.
I can provide specific cases if you'd like, but the statistical improvement in outcomes is undeniable. The silence that followed was profound. Eleanor realized that this was the first time her parents had heard a direct professional evaluation of her work's impact from someone with no political motivation to flatter the royal family. King Frederick placed his napkin beside his plate and leaned back in his chair.
Dr. Martinez, what challenges do you still face that research might help address? Eleanor's heart raced. Her father was essentially asking Dr.
Martinez to suggest future research projects, indicating that he was not only supporting Eleanor's current work but encouraging its expansion. Your Majesty, our biggest remaining challenge is mental health support for children and families dealing with chronic illnesses. The medical treatment protocols have improved dramatically, but we're still struggling with the psychological impact of serious illness.
Eleanor felt excitement building.
Mental health research was territory she hadn't explored yet, but Dr. Martinez was describing exactly the kind of problem her research methods could address. Marcus, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up.
What kind of psychological impact?
Dr. Martinez turned to him with genuine warmth.
Well, Prince Marcus, imagine being 8 years old and spending months in a hospital.
Even when we cure the medical problem, children often struggle with anxiety, depression, and difficulty readjusting to normal life.
And their families? Parents often develop their own trauma from watching their children suffer. Siblings feel neglected and confused.
The whole family system can be destabilized even after successful medical treatment. Eleanor watched her brother's face carefully. Marcus was asking questions with unusual seriousness, and she realized he was genuinely invested in understanding these issues. Queen Isabella reached for her wine glass with her right hand, then paused and switched to her left before taking a sip. Eleanor recognized this as her mother's signal for careful consideration of new information.
Dr. Martinez, the Queen said slowly, what kind of research would be most helpful in addressing these mental health challenges?
Your Majesty, we need to understand which support interventions are most effective for different age groups and family situations. We also need research on how to integrate mental health support into medical treatment protocols without overwhelming already stressed families. King Frederick nodded thoughtfully.
This sounds like exactly the kind of research Princess Eleanor's foundation could undertake.
Eleanor felt a thrill of anticipation, but she forced herself to ask the practical question.
Dr. Martinez, would you be willing to collaborate with my research team on mental health studies? Princess Eleanor, I would be honored to work with you.
Your approach to research focusing on practical implementation and real-world outcomes is exactly what we need in mental health support. The main course arrived as the conversation took on an increasingly collaborative tone. Eleanor found herself discussing research methodologies, data collection challenges, and potential pilot programs with someone whose expertise complemented her own analytical skills perfectly. Marcus continued asking thoughtful questions, particularly about how mental health challenges affected children his own age. Eleanor realized her brother was developing genuine empathy and understanding that went far beyond casual curiosity.
Dr. Martinez, Marcus said during the main course, do you think teenagers react differently to illness than younger kids? Absolutely, Prince Marcus.
Teenagers often struggle with feeling different from their peers, losing independence, and worrying about how illness will affect their future plans. They need very different support than younger children. Eleanor watched her brother absorb this information with obvious concern. She realized that Marcus was beginning to understand how his privileged position could be used to address real suffering experienced by people his own age. As dessert arrived, King Frederick made a gesture Eleanor had never seen before. He picked up his dessert spoon and placed it horizontally across the top of his plate, then immediately picked it up and began eating normally. The double signal seemed to indicate both completion of serious business and transition to celebration. Dr. Martinez, King Frederick said, this conversation has been extraordinarily valuable.
I hope you'll consider serving as an official advisor to Eleanor's research foundation.
Dr. Martinez's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude.
Your Majesty, I would be deeply honored. Queen Isabella smiled warmly.
Dr. Martinez, we would also like to invite you to return for dinner regularly, as Eleanor's research projects develop. Your perspective helps us understand the real-world impact of policy changes in ways we couldn't access otherwise. Eleanor felt tears threatening to spill over. Her parents weren't just supporting her work, they were embracing it and seeking to expand its impact.
Marcus raised his water glass in a toast.
To Dr. Martinez, for helping Eleanor save kids' lives, and for teaching me that being a prince means more than I thought it did. Everyone at the table raised their glasses, and Eleanor saw something beautiful in that moment. The formal dining codes that had once seemed restrictive and intimidating had become tools for creating meaningful connections and facilitating important work. Dr. Martinez looked around the table with obvious emotion. Your Majesties, Princess Eleanor, Prince Marcus, thank you for showing me that real change is possible when people with resources choose to listen to people with expertise. As the evening ended, Eleanor lingered in the dining room with her family. The empty plates, carefully positioned glasses, and formal silverware told the story of a meal that had accomplished something unprecedented. Eleanor, King Frederick said quietly, you've taught us something important about the responsibility that comes with our position.
Queen Isabella nodded in agreement.
Your research has shown us that we can honor tradition while using our platform to create meaningful change. Marcus grinned at his sister. Plus, you've made family dinners way more interesting than they used to be. Eleanor laughed, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude for her family's support and excited about the work that lay ahead.
The wordless dinner codes had evolved from simple family communication tools into a framework for building bridges between royal responsibility and real-world impact.
The dining room felt different now, not just a place where the royal family shared meals, but a space where important conversations could happen and meaningful relationships could be forged.
The dinner codes had proven their ultimate power, facilitating connections that could literally save lives.
As Eleanor finally prepared to leave the dining room, she touched the edge of the mahogany table where she had learned so much about family, responsibility, and the possibility of creating change. Tomorrow, she would begin her next research project, but tonight, she sat in grateful silence, surrounded by the evidence of a family meal that had changed everything.